Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Francesca. I'm the founder of the Great British Entrepreneur Awards. And like many of you on this call will probably know, that the awards does far more than just celebrate successes on stage. We are a community and offer advice and support from our panel of judges and our partners. And we're delighted today to be joined by our partners at UBS. In this session, we'll be talking to Matthew Carter, an investment strategist at UBS, specialising in entrepreneur and executive topics, Cecilia Wan, the Global Head of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion and Employee Relations for UBS, and Paul Donovan, UBS Wealth Management's Chief Economist and author of many books, including the most recent one, Profit and Prejudice, The Luddites of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, looking at the increasing economic risks arising from prejudice, which was published in November 2020. We'll be using this session to look into entrepreneur challenges for the decade ahead, hiring and integrating a more diverse workforce is just the beginning of the challenge, but getting diversity, equity and inclusion right in a workplace is also good for the bottom line. There is an opportunity to ask questions during this session. Please do use the Q&A function if you are joining us on Zoom, or else the comment section if you are joining us from elsewhere. If you've got a question to ask, just pop it in and we'll do our best to answer throughout the session. So without further ado, because there's a lot to get through, let's get straight to it. And Paul, I'm going to come to you first. Could you tell us what inspired you to write the book, Profit and Prejudice?
Well, that's quite a complicated question. I suppose it started almost 15 years ago when I was asked to do some work about long-term rates of growth. And it became increasingly obvious that the importance of the labour market to long-term rates of growth meant that we had to look for the right person in the right job at the right time, and that actually prejudice was going to be an obstacle to getting the right person in the right job at the right time, and that was going to damage long-term rates of growth. And then around 2013, we start to have the debate about marriage equality here in the UK and the United States and so on. And UBS was very active in the court cases in the United States. And with that, it became very clear that the economic arguments around this were just hopelessly basic. There wasn't any proper consideration. It was all, how much is a gay wedding going to generate in revenue for the economy? Well, that's hardly the point. And so that really sort of stimulated me writing a lot more on the topics of diversity and inclusion. And as we've gone through into this period of very dramatic structural change, looking at how structural change perhaps encourages prejudice, because it does sadly tend to, and how much damage that prejudice can do. So there are lots of factors coming together, but it was basically looking at how do we get the most efficient, the most effective economy we can get over the medium term.
I really should have got used to being on mute after 2 years of Zoom calls. Thank you, Paul. Now the next question is quite broad as well. And Paul, I'm going to come to you first on this, but Cecilia and Matthew, if you've got anything that you would like to add to this, please do. So it's a broad question, but I think it's important. How do you define prejudice?
So I would say, from an economic perspective, prejudice is not discrimination. Now, this is economists playing with semantics, obviously, but discrimination is simply choosing one thing over another. You discriminate in making a choice. And if that is rational, if your decision to say, okay, I want to hire this person, not this person, then, as long as it's rational, that's fine. If I'm going to say, well, this person's got a degree in economics and this person's got a degree in law, and I want an economist, it is perfectly rational for me to choose the qualified economist over the lawyer. And so that's perfectly rational. What I would say prejudice is irrational discrimination. So if I'm saying this person's got red hair and I don't like red hair, so I'm not going to hire them, well, that's entirely irrational. The color of their hair or their skin or their sexuality or their religion have nothing to do with their ability to perform a function. So that's irrational discrimination coming through. And that, for me, is what prejudice is.
Fantastic. Does anybody else have anything to add there? Or?
Yeah, and I would say that, just going on the same sort of lines, I think I would like to think that people don't go around going, I am not choosing somebody because of their religion, their sexual orientation, etc., etc. What I find that is a bit more pervasive is prejudice comes out in the form of unconscious bias, right? And therefore becomes a bigger issue, because it is not that somebody is saying, I choose you over you because of an irrational decision that has been thought about in a sort of clear, coherent way, but that is how decisions are being made unconsciously because of prejudice that they hold, that they may not even know that they hold.
Yeah, that's a great point. And in terms of how it can harm society economically, how do we think prejudice does harm society? And I'll open that one up to the floor.
Well, I would say from an economic perspective, there are actually two ways in which prejudice does damage. So the first thing is, as I was saying, because labor is so important to how an economy functions, how society functions, it is about having the right person in the right job at the right time. And if you have got prejudice, unconscious bias or conscious bias, as Cecilia rightly says, unconscious bias is the really dangerous element of prejudice, then you're not going to get the right person in place. And that's either because you're failing to hire the right person, or alternatively, because you've created an environment where the stress of being somebody in a minority group, for example, means that you don't perform to the best of your ability. If you're constantly being put down, told you're somehow less than other people, it's implied that you don't have the same value as other people in society, you're not going to perform at your best. So that's also going to stop the right person being in the right place, because the right person is being sort of repressed and pushed into another way. So one of the big issues with sexuality, for example, if you can't be out at work, if you're constantly self-censoring, then you're not going to be your most productive. You're not going to be the best that you can. But the other thing I think that matters is also the diversity, because we need diversity of opinion. If the only opinion sitting around the table is that of white Anglo-Saxon middle-aged bald men, not an opinion I've got anything against, quite clearly. I'm all in favor of white Anglo-Saxon middle-aged bald men. But if that's the only opinion you're hearing, you're going to miss opportunities. And what's worse, you're going to miss risks. And that's going to be disastrous. So for me, the whole damage of prejudice is you don't get the right people in place, and you don't have the diversity of opinion that allows you to spot the opportunities and risks that are thrown up in the business world, in the economy at large, and in society.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I saw that you were asked this next question somewhere else, and I thought the answer was really interesting. So I'm going to ask it again for our audience. Does being an economist make it easier to fight prejudice with facts?
To which the answer, as it always is in economics, is yes and no. So I think that economics is a training which tries to look at things objectively. So we do try and remove bias. I mean, that's the whole raison d'etre of economics. It's to try and objectively look at things. And on some questions, I think economists have done some really good work about the impact of immigration in society, for example. There's very often prejudice against immigration, and we can show that actually, immigrants are not stealing jobs or driving down wages. They're actually beneficial, and that helps to tackle prejudice in that way. There's been some excellent work. I mean, it goes right back to Gary Becker, who started doing work on this in the 1950s, looking at the economics of racial prejudice and being able to be very objective and saying, well, actually, this is what happens to companies that pursue racial prejudice. These are the consequences. So we can do all of that. The problem is economists are not very good at communicating. This is the problem. So, we can identify the prejudice. We can write these fantastic papers explaining the economic consequence of the prejudice, and nobody listens to us. So one of the really big problems is, in the world of sound bites and hashtags and so on, economists are not good on TikTok, frankly. Physicists are better than economists at communicating over Twitter. And when the physicists are beating you at communication skills, you've probably got a problem. So we're struggling to get the message across because we're not very good at storytelling. And so much about prejudice, as Cecilia was saying earlier on, it's the unconscious bias. It's sort of an emotional reaction. And cold, hard facts don't necessarily beat an emotional reaction. And that's what economists, frankly, need to be better at doing.
But that also says as well that, building on Paul's point there, I mean, many of our listeners today who are running sort of businesses will increasingly be looking at running purpose-driven businesses. And the thing is that the purpose-driven business does not sell a good or service. It does not attract customers purely on the basis of facts and figures from people like Paul. And so I think that it's also important for many entrepreneurs to really ask that question of not just what are we selling, but what do we stand for? And I think that that's one of the reasons why the broader movement towards diversity, equity, and inclusion is becoming more important, because it's becoming a more important part of the DNA of businesses of all sizes. I think a second additional point that we should not forget here as well is that we're all joining you today from a large multinational institution. And hopefully the work that we do to advance DE&I is important. But for people like you running small and mid-sized enterprises that account for around 90% of global businesses, more than 50% of global employment, if businesses like yours aren't part of the movement to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion for moral, philosophical, religious, but also commercial reasons, then society at large will not change. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So look, if we dig a bit deeper into that, and you say, you talked about commercial reasons, and this is open to the panel, how can diversity and inclusion boost the bottom line?
Well, I think that in some of the work that we've done for executives and entrepreneurs, I think there are a number of reasons, and we'd need a lot longer than an hour to discuss all of them. But keeping to the rule of threes, I'll stick with three. I think the first is the labour market point that Paul has written, and there's two aspects to that. There's the aspect of having the right person in the right job at the right time as part of the longer term structural changes that we're seeing in the economy, the so-called fourth industrial revolution. And we're moving to a world where increasingly technology and human labor are not mutually exclusive. It's not going to be an AI-led robot revolution. We'll still need people, but the types of jobs that they're required to do will change. The types of skills that are required to make the most use of that technology will change, and we'll necessarily need to get the most out of the global talent pool. Now, if we are not diverse, equitable, and inclusive, and we're leaving talent on the side because of an overt prejudice or an unconscious bias, then businesses are leaving an opportunity to really have a productive workforce that embraces these new challenges. I'd also say as well that we sometimes hear from business owners that if you're in a more tactical environment where jobs markets are tight, the United States, the United Kingdom, many other developed markets, if you're struggling to hire workers, have you looked at the opportunity to tap into previously overlooked talent pools because of unconscious bias or overt prejudice? Because you might be overlooking a group of workers who can add a lot of value to your business, but with whom you've never previously worked because of some impediment to really seeing their true worth. So I think the first is on the labour market side. I think the second side is to do with innovation and risk management, as Paul has alluded to. So there's a whole bunch of studies out there, most famously from McKinsey over the last few years, that look at diversity particularly on gender and racial diversity in C-suite management. And the figures are pretty clear. more diverse management boards, particularly for mid and larger companies, mean that your firm is more likely to deliver market-beating profitability as measured by EBIT margins. And one of the reasons for that is that diverse teams have been proven again through academic studies to be more innovative. So they can solve problems in more creative ways. They can find untapped market opportunities. But they're also very good at managing risks better, because there's a great risk if you have a so-called monoculture where everyone doesn't necessarily look the same, but comes from similar backgrounds, that there's a temptation towards groupthink. And in fact, there was quite a famous study that was suggesting that if you look at more diverse teams, they're not only 20% more innovative, but they're 30% better at identifying and managing risks. So there's the innovation and risk management side. And then for me, the third point is market access. So there's been a lot of talk around deglobalization trends, supply chain challenges over the last few years. But we still live in a world, particularly after COVID, where people communicate, they add value on networks, they buy on global networks, the internet or whatever. And in that type of environment, business owners have to acknowledge that their consumer base is becoming more heterogeneous. Now, you don't necessarily need to have somebody who shares a particular characteristic as another sort of demographic to be the best person to design a good or service for them. But clearly, every business owner would say that if you want to sell a good or service to a particular group of people, you are more likely to sell that if you understand the particular challenges that this group of people faces and that your product is trying to solve. And so in a world of global connectivity where you have increasingly diverse consumer bases, it just seems logical that more diverse teams with inclusivity, so those diverse ideas make it through to commercial outcomes and customer satisfaction, that as you have a more diverse client base, so your team should be more diverse too. And with that diversity, we'd expect increased market access to come. So for me, three things: the labor market, number one; number two, innovation; and number three, market access.
And just to add to Matthew's point that, there is also a danger of not being inclusive or diverse in the way that you design your products, the way that you think about your client base. I think everybody knows the research that's been done, for instance, around seatbelts in cars, right? Because the people who designed it and put them in cars are in predominantly sort of male engineers potentially. It appears that seatbelts as designed today, women are 47% more likely to be seriously injured in a car crash and 17% more likely to die, because it hasn't been thought through how you deal with the female physique and the fact that we tend to sit closer to the wheel when we drive, right? So that sort of thing could have potentially disastrous consequences, right? So there's a commercial aspect and what that does, but also, what are we missing? What damage are we doing by not being more diverse in the way that we look and put together products in the first place?
Yeah, thanks, Cecilia. So how would you say that businesses can best measure their levels of diversity and inclusion?
Well, diversity is, about sort of the people you've got represented in the room, so to speak, right? So, you can measure that by looking at demographic data, and in the UK, most aspects of demographics can be asked. People can consent to providing that data, so you can quite easily, if you encourage your employees to self-disclose and talk about their identity and be open with their identity, you can get data around the diversity that's in your workplace. On inclusion, this is not as easy to get to, because inclusion is about how you feel, how you perceive yourself in the general order of things at the place of work, right? Do you feel that you have equal access to career opportunities, no matter what your background is? Do you feel that your opinion, even if they're completely different from everybody else in the room, is sought and welcomed? Do you feel comfortable challenging that status quo? Do you get regular feedback? It's all about that sort of feeling of belonging. So measuring that, you can do one of two ways. If you're at a certain size where you can guarantee sort of anonymity, you can ask survey questions, right? That's, how many of the bigger organizations do it. You ask them in a way where every employee is asked the same question, and in a way that's sort of fairly clearly understood. And you get then a feeling back, or, you get a measurable data-driven approach in terms of looking at employee sentiment. How do people feel about their place in the organization? And of course, people vote with their feet. So if they are in an organization where they don't feel that there is inclusion and that culture of belonging, then they're going to leave, right? And so looking at attrition will also help you to see if there are segments of your population that are leaving at different rates to other people.
Thanks, Cecilia. Paul, in your book, you said that the fourth industrial revolution, so defined as automation and technology in business, is in many ways reversing the social changes of the first. What do you mean by that?
Well, so this is, when we go back to the first industrial revolution, what is happening is you are taking people who are largely self-employed, generally working from home, generally supplied by things that are local. So, your food comes from local sources, your clothing comes from local sources, and you're moving, sort of a self-employed weaver working in a cottage in Wiltshire up to a dark satanic mill in Manchester. And all of a sudden, everything's changing. You're no longer working for yourself. You're no longer working your own hours. It's, a shift system. You're not working at home anymore. You're going to somewhere else for work. So that changes real estate demand. You can't grow your own food in Manchester. It's got to be imported from outside. Goods are starting to come from all over the world. So you have that really, really dramatic shift. Now think what's happening now. You're taking an economist working in a dark satanic bank in London, and now I can work from home at Wiltshire. Now I can work more flexible hours as long as I get the job done. If I want to go plan out my next research paper by walking around a field, I can go and do that. We're starting to see more localization of production, where we're not getting these long, complex supply chains. Supply chains are simplifying, coming a lot shorter. So you can see that we went through this process of massive urbanization and globalization, and now we're sort of partially reversing a lot of that. And of course, it's a really traumatic upheaval. A lot of the things that, have been sort of established for 250 years about how we work, how we consume, where we consume, the social hierarchies, the values of different jobs that come out of all of that, we're turning a lot of this upside down. And that's the structural social upheaval that we're going through at the moment.
Thank you, Paul.
Still waiting for Paul to finish his weaving, though, to do the true turn back to the first.
Yes, give it time, I think, before I start making my own suits.
So another one open up to the panel. How true do you think it is that all of us have unconscious biases, and how can we overcome that when it comes to running businesses, and I guess particularly looking at recruitment and hiring?
I mean, I'll kick off and then would love to hear from Matthew and Paul. But, I think anyone who says that they don't have unconscious bias is, it just is not true. Every single person on this planet, you're not born with them, but you develop them through growing up, the environment that you're in, through immersion in, the media, through the exposure that you have. These are implicit associations through years of social conditioning and exposure that build up an immediate emotional response to things that you see and the people that you meet. And they are unconscious. So I wanted, just to talk about what I was saying earlier, overt discrimination or prejudice, there are, fewer people who will actually overtly say, I genuinely believe that women are inferior to men because they're women, right? However, when you then look at the way that we're doing our hiring, promotions, paying people, you see that unconscious bias coming in because they're not being hired, promoted, and paid at the same rate as men. So you can say that you're not, and you genuinely believe that you're not, right? And by the way, just using that as an example, it's not necessarily just the men that hold an unconscious bias. Some women hold unconscious biases against their own gender because they associate, for instance, women with a particular role in child rearing, right? Or there's an association that you have when you see somebody or you meet somebody. So the only way that you can really overcome that is being very conscious of what your unconscious biases are. You can actually test it. There are certain tests out there that you can do. I think there's an implicit association test with Harvard that you could try, for instance, and that is testing very quick reactions to things that you're seeing so that you can understand if or where you may potentially have a bias. And then just being very conscious about the fact that you may be biased, being open and honest with yourself that there may be a bias within you, and taking steps to actually do something consciously to overcome that bias, right? That's obviously educating yourself, making sure that your networks are wider and you can understand and build different associations with people to sort of override the conditioning that you've lived through your entire life. But actually taking material steps to look at the way you're hiring, for instance, really pushing to make sure that you have considered a diverse candidate pool. Have we done everything we can? And it does require extra effort to do this, to make sure that the candidates I'm bringing into the organization or considering to the organization are diverse, right? So that I'm giving opportunity, for people to join me. And then you can look back at your metrics and go, how have I done? Look at the people that you have hired and just have that check and balance and go, right, have I actually made progress in the way that I'm hiring? So you can do that for hiring, you can do that for promotions, for instance, depending on your organization and how you might want to be able to or are able to measure things. So those are just some ideas, but Matthew and Paul, if
well, I just add to sort of Cecilia's point there that if we accept that we all have unconscious biases, I think it also leads to this misconception that we've written about before, that diversity, equity, and inclusion is basically exclusively the reserve of founders or entrepreneurs or top managers in a larger company. And if we all have unconscious biases, ranging from a founder down to somebody who is working in another part of the business, then clearly tone from the top is important because that helps to set culture, which is crucial to driving meaningful change rather than paying lip service to DE&I. But if everybody has their own unconscious biases, it makes it even more important for diversity, equity, and inclusion to be something that is the responsibility of the whole company. I think I'd also add as well that we touched a little earlier on how some of the DE&I challenges can come in crucial things like hiring, pay decisions, and also particularly in this economic climate, who you decide to let go of. Now, in smaller businesses, the founder may have their hand on the tiller on all of these decisions, but many of you will reach a size where it becomes totally impractical for you to sign off every single HR decision. And when those HR decisions move down to more of your middle management structure, that is really one of the most crucial areas to get right for DE&I success. So I think that to all of Cecilia's points, unconscious bias is in all of us, which means that if you want to be a more diverse, equitable and inclusive firm for commercial and non-commercial reasons. It has to be a whole of company effort, and it really has to tackle everybody's unconscious biases as their own responsibility, but also everyone should see it as their own opportunity, because if we remove some of these illogical barriers to doing business out of the way, it follows that you can do more business in a way that better reflects your firm's and yours as an entrepreneur's values. Everyone's a winner.
And just to echo the point about the whole organization having to embrace this. I mean, I can remember I started doing an internship at another bank, not UBS, back in 1991. And I can remember almost on my first day, the administrative assistant who was sort of showing me how to use the systems and so on said, "Oh, don't talk to that person over there, he's gay." Not realizing, of course, that was my signal to rush over and get his phone number. Only mobile phones hadn't been invented at that point. But the message that I got was, don't dare come out. Because the admin assistant was basically saying, if you're gay, no one's going to speak to you. And so that was a very clear message to me. And, I bolted the closet door and stayed very comfortably inside. And so that is just one indication of just how important it is to get the corporate culture exactly right. And I think in terms of trying to tackle unconscious bias and realizing it, there is in the fourth industrial revolution a sort of a bad news, good news aspect, which is social media and the connections we have over social media. So the bad news is that social media does allow people to throw off unconscious bias and just be overtly prejudiced, and some of the the hate that they would never dream of saying in person, but behind the anonymity of a keyboard, they just spew this horrible hatred out into society. But then the good news is that you can form what are called parasocial contact over social media. That is to say, you can watch a YouTuber or somebody on TikTok, or you follow somebody on Twitter, and you get to know them. Now, you don't actually know them in real life. You may not actually interact with them on a regular basis, but you get to know them and you get to understand them and aspects of their lives. And that scope of social media means that you get to know and understand people who are having different characteristics to you in a way that you might find more difficult if you're in a relatively, a small town setting, for example. You may not know many members of the trans community, but if you follow a couple of them on Twitter, all of a sudden you start to know and understand them, and that helps challenge your unconscious bias as well. So social media has done huge amounts of damage, but it also has huge amounts of potential to tackle some of our unconscious bias too.
Thank you, everybody. So it's clear that every employee has an integral role to play in spurring a company, regardless of size, closer to achieving its strategic diversity, equity, and inclusion priorities. And Matthew, earlier you mentioned you talked about some sort of misconceptions, and I'd just like to touch on, we know that this audience in this virtual room is mainly at the helm of small businesses. What would the panel say that are some misconceptions that hinder firms from being more diverse, particularly those smaller private firms that have fewer resources than large multinational companies?
Well, I mean, I mentioned one, but I'll focus on the other two. I think the first misconception is that basically diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies should look the same for each and every company. And I think that there are a number of reasons why actually it's beholden on business owners and entrepreneurs to actually look at their own circumstances and actually work out what is best for the overall operation of their company. It goes without saying that there are social norms and there are laws that we all have to adhere to, and quite rightly, depending on which jurisdiction in which we work. But it would also be right to say that there are different social mores around the world, and we do have to understand that in some jurisdictions it will be more challenging for business owners and entrepreneurs to tackle certain types of of unconscious bias or prejudice, because regrettably they are more part of the social fabric there. So I don't think that it makes sense to say that there is a cookie cutter approach that every single small and mid-sized and indeed large corporation can just roll out globally across all chapters of its business. So I think it really makes sense to sort of understand the environment in which the business works. But I think that what's also important to acknowledge, and Paul discusses this in his book as well, is that the commercial and non-commercial gains from being more diverse, equitable, and inclusive will tend to accrue more to those companies where ideas like knowledge sharing, problem solving, innovation, risk management, and having to be more adaptive to more complex world sort of situations, market situations, really matter more to the bottom line. We give an example in some of the research to say that would you get the same gains from investing in diversity, equity, and inclusion in one industry that's a knowledge-based industry or a knowledge-based business as you would if you operated a company that basically does a lower value added and more repetitive type task? And the scientific evidence and the academic studies do suggest the gains tend to accrue more to those knowledge-based companies. And I think that what that really means for business owners is not to say if you work, for example, in a haulage company where everybody who works in the company is basically doing the same task of driving a vehicle, do you want to not invest in D, E, and I at all? The answer is no. It will still potentially lead to gains for your business, but would those gains be the same as if you were in a company providing IT services globally or writing web copy and advertising to businesses? They won't be the same. So what I think is that one misconception is that every firm needs to follow the same D, E, and I strategy. And then another misconception, I think, around D, E, and I is people get confused between two types of equality. There's equality of opportunity, which is, I believe, one of the fundamental tenets of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is that you want to give everybody the same opportunity to use their innate talents to shine for themselves and for your business, and equality of outcome. And I think that sometimes people conflate those ideas, and particularly when you get into, I guess, some of the more challenging part, or the more heavily debated parts of diversity, equity, and inclusion, such as the use of quotas, there is a certain quarter of people who then confuse equality of opportunity with equality of outcome. Fundamentally, to go back to Paul's original point, what diversity, equity, and inclusion attempts to do is to stop illogical or irrelevant barriers to somebody doing a job being in place. But it still acknowledges, as Paul said about the logical discrimination point, that if I interview for a role to become a potter, and I'm absolutely useless at potting, that if I had a certain characteristic about me that meant that I was in a minority group, should I get the role to be a potter if fundamentally I'm actually useless at potting and there's somebody else who's got great potting talents? No, we're not trying to strive for a sort of socially engineered equality of outcome, because people are still fundamentally different. I can't do potting, but I can write a bit and research markets, so I'm in the right place. But fundamentally, that's not what diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies are trying to do. And so that misconception and that misunderstanding that between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome, I think, is also something that business owners would do well to consider.
Thank you, Matthew.
Just sorry, is it okay if I just add to that point? So what Matthew's talking about there is the equity part of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So to have an understanding that because of a person's individual characteristic, that alone should not be a barrier to getting access to opportunities. That and to make sure that the programs, the policies, the practices, the way you do things at your company, at your enterprise, does not create that barrier, or unconsciously or otherwise, and that people, with on the surface, everything else being equal, will have the same opportunity to sort of reach whatever their potential is. Not everybody has the potential to be CEO or whatever, but to be able to thrive. So it's just sort of that equality of opportunities really the focus of the equity part of DE&I.
Thanks, Cecilia. Sorry, Paul.
I was just going to add that I think, obviously, one of the challenges for a small business is we don't have Cecilia. Cecilia is working for us as a large global corporation and is absolutely brilliant, but a small business is not going to have people like Cecilia with their years of expertise and knowledge. But that doesn't mean that you're without resources. And this is a bit of self-aggrandizement, because I was a commissioner on the Shinkwin Commission at the Institute of Directors, which has come up with a practical guide for how small businesses can help improve their equity, diversity, and inclusion approach. And then other organizations looking at specific characteristics like Stonewall, for example, also come up with very practical approaches for actually this is what you can think about. So just because you don't have a hugely talented HR department doesn't mean that you can't get help. There are the IOD is publishing its recommendations for free, open access to anybody. Stonewall, I know, do the same. Disability groups are doing the same sort of thing. There is a lot of resource out there with really practical suggestions developed by the business community with small businesses in mind.
Thank you. We have an observation here from Jody, who says when organisations look at diversity, they more often than not leave out disability, which excludes 1 in 5 working age adults. Does anybody on the panel have any thoughts or further observations there?
I would say that that is the general perception. If you talk about diversity, people immediately think of men and women, immediately think of perhaps race and ethnicity, and then other aspects might sort of come in as an afterthought, right? And that includes disability. I think it is about making sure that you're trying. I know it sounds a difficult thing to do, but you need to think about every aspect of diversity, right? And you're right that to exclude or put barriers in place so that you're missing out on fantastic talent because they happen to have a disability it's damaging to you as a company. You're missing out on that input, and so what can you do? Again, just looking at that sort of equality of opportunity, what can you do to eliminate barriers to allow that to happen? And just going back to the question about sort of the pandemic, right? In a way, that was a great leveler and also helped for people with disabilities to be able to contribute, because everybody was in the same space. You had to work from home, right? And you had your equipment around you, you contributed that way. And it just meant that potentially those with difficulties in commuting, in getting into the office, in being surrounded by a busy office atmosphere, that those things that everybody was in the same position. And what I would hate is for the fact that actually being able to tap into that wider talent pool, because we've now got better ways of being able to work more flexibly, disappears over the course of time. That we learned a lesson, I think, during the pandemic on how we can work and be more inclusive through being more flexible. And I hope that would be here to stay.
Thanks, Cecilia.
Sorry,
Paul.
So I would just add that I think that there is a problem with prejudice and discrimination, or not a problem. There's an issue we have to be conscious of, in that some characteristics are more visible than other characteristics. So generally, not always, but generally, gender and race are more visible characteristics, whereas a lot of disability, particularly, of course, neurodiversity, and sexuality and so on, these can be hidden. And the sort of the dividing line for me, I think, is is another member of your family likely to share the characteristic? So if you think about gender or race or religion, other people in your family will share that characteristic, and that will shape your approach towards that characteristic as somebody who might be subject to prejudice. Whereas with physical disability, neurodiversity, with sexuality, those are not often characteristics that are automatically shared by another member of your family. And in fact, you may be subject to prejudice from within your family because of your characteristic. And so you've got this sort of divide between these two groups. And I think the question is quite right, that we very often tend to focus on the more visible ones, and yet the invisible ones have just as much damage if the prejudice is allowed to come through.
Thank you so much. I'm really conscious of the time, which is absolutely flown by. We should have put a longer marker in everyone's diaries. I knew this would be a great conversation. I guess to close, and I think it's a really interesting question we've had from Michelle, do the panel have any thoughts on how to shift the perception that diversity, equity and inclusion policies are not just box ticking, and it has to be done to a real cultural shift throughout the business? Are there any thoughts on that? I think it's an important one.
Well, I'll start by just reiterating the point that I mentioned earlier, that if you do want to drive sort of genuine change, then it has to be something that cascades down through the whole organization. And I think that, to Cecilia's point earlier, where she was talking about some of the ways to sort of measure it, I mean, diversity, equity and inclusion, I think it has to be something that even small and mid-sized business owners with fewer resources place enough emphasis on to say that we're going to do our utmost, either in-house or with external consultants, to measure this, and that means numbers. And a box-ticking exercise is not really quite the same as like a more thorough quantitative assessment. And I think as well that the impression with sort of like a box-ticking exercise is that maybe once the boxes are ticked, that the responsibility ends. So many firms, including larger ones, are putting more of a focus through objectives and key results on things like diversity and equity and inclusion, on senior managers and even founders and the heads of companies. So I think that if firms want to drive genuine change, and they want to do that for their employees, but for their company purpose and their company profits, then it has to be more than a box ticking exercise. And I think that more of a framework has to be built to sort of have a policy to measure it, and then fundamentally make somebody responsible for it. And I think that we will see, as part of the broader movement in society towards more sustainable and impact businesses and ESG, both from businesses themselves, but also those that fund them and may want to buy them, that this becomes more important and measurement becomes more important. So I think that this is a trend that is going to change. And as we say in much of our entrepreneur research, business owners can either make the changes organically themselves now to get ahead of their competition and have a competitive advantage, or they can wait until what in many jurisdictions will be inevitable, which is the laws will change, and suddenly you will have to measure it. It will have to be more than a box-ticking exercise. Somebody in senior management will be on the hook for it. And I think business owners instinctively know, being nimble wealth creators, that it's much better to be ahead of a trend than it is to lag and then play catch up.
And I think the more that you are transparent with the people in your organization and even publicly about what you're doing and how you're measuring progress, and how you see that this is not we're going to get to some magical figure and we're done kind of thing, that it's an ongoing endeavor. I think that the more that you naturally will be held to account, because you'll be held to account by the court of public opinion, the people who buy your products, who have invest in you, for instance. But it is about a cultural shift and transformation. So leading by example, if you're a founder of an organization, or in top management, it has to be meaningful, not just standing up and say, I think diversity is important. You need to be really humble and explain why you feel it's important. You have to be an active ally, right? Actively support. If people don't see you doing things that support what you're saying, then frankly, the trust that actually it's important to you will be gone. So, have a think about, how do you hold your people to account to have the same standards that you have on diversity? How do you make sure that the importance of this topic is cascaded through the organization? Matthew touched on this, but how do you assess performance? Does it affect the way that you consider somebody's performance or the way you reward them if there's a bonus structure, for instance? How important is this so that it's incorporated into that, so that people have it as part of their objectives? If there is a role model in the organization who does really well, are you publicly praising them, publicly showing, this is somebody I hold out to be a role model? And are you acting swiftly if people aren't displaying inclusive behaviors, aren't doing what they need to do to create the kind of culture that you want, right? So if you don't act, people will think that you're condoning the behaviors that they're seeing, or that is what it takes to sort of survive or gain seniority in the organization. And therefore you need to act swiftly and make sure that is sort of dealt with very quickly. You need to think about the whole of, the employee life cycle. We touched upon it earlier. There's a lot of focus on hiring, but once you've got good people in your organization, from various backgrounds, what are you doing to make sure that everybody is developed, that barriers are being removed? And so, every part of the pay, promotion, development, what opportunities people are given, the great projects that things, that they're assigned to, being assigned overseas, or, any of those things that help somebody developmentally. Are you being open about thinking who should get those opportunities, right? And then I would also say that you should also think about how you're manifesting things through your ecosystem of influence. Are you thinking of DE&I not only about your employee base, but also about the suppliers that you use, the client base that you're, marketing to, the way that you design products, as I mentioned earlier about the seatbelts, for instance, how you do that, and also your impact from a community perspective in your local area, right, where you hold your business. So there are many ways that you can actively show that it is more than just a policy or a tick box for you, and that it means so much more.
Thank you, Cecilia. Paul, can I come to you to close?
I was just going to say, to Cecilia's point, I think for entrepreneurs generally, it is important to recognize that leadership on diversity and equity and inclusion is not just about leaders leading from the front. That I think leaders need to recognize that you're not necessarily an expert in the challenges faced by a different characteristic. It's not all about a rousing speech from the podium. Sometimes the leader needs to be sitting at the back of the audience, next to the graduate trainee or the person who's just joined the organization, and listening to what other people have to say. And the signal that sends, I think, can be extraordinarily powerful and help to shape the culture. If the chief exec or the entrepreneur is saying, actually, I need to learn more about this, that's a very strong signal. And we had this at UBS over this summer, where Ralph, our chief exec, came and attended Zurich Pride. And it was absolutely not Ralph turns up, seizes a microphone, gives a speech, and is whisked off in a limo. No, Ralph turns up, puts on the T-shirt, and marches in 35-degree heat for 4 hours, talking with everybody there. And it was a fantastic example of leadership. He was really interested in what people had had to say about the challenges they faced, about how they felt about UBS's approach to diversity and inclusion. And that sort of thing, I think, really makes a difference. And to the point, it makes sure that the organization as a whole is being shaped by the leaders, shaped by the entrepreneurs, but not that the entrepreneur is saying, I know everything about diversity and inclusion, because of course nobody does. The importance of listening and participating, living diversity and inclusion, I think is very, very strong.
Thank you so much, Matthew, Paul and Cecilia, and thank you to UBS for being part of this conversation, really supporting entrepreneurs, and for all of the work you're doing. It's been an absolute pleasure this morning. And like I said, I feel like we could easily have gone on for another hour, but we have overrun it already. Thank you to everybody for joining us today. And please do get in touch with us if there's anything else that we can do to help or support you, or any questions that you have that we didn't get a chance to get around to. I'll leave everybody to enjoy the rest of their Wednesday wherever they are. Thank you once again for joining.